The dust kicked up around Quentin Hayes' boots as he rode into town on his chestnut stallion, the afternoon sun beating down on his broad shoulders. The last time he'd been in Silver Creek, he'd left with nothing but a broken heart and the taste of whiskey on his lips. That was 5 years ago. 5 long years, and still, he could recall the softness of her mouth beneath the stars, the scent of wildflowers in her hair. He hadn't planned on returning, but a man needed supplies, and Silver Creek was the only town within a day's ride of his new homestead. The town had grown since he'd last seen it. The main street was longer now, with more buildings lining each side. The saloon still stood proudly at the center, its swinging doors creaking in the dry breeze. A new hotel had been built beside it, 3 stories of freshly painted wood and glass windows that caught the sunlight. The general store had expanded too, taking over what used to be the barber's shop. Quentin pulled his horse to a stop outside the hitching post, swinging his leg over and dropping to the ground with practiced ease. His spurs jangled as he secured his mount, patting the horse's neck affectionately. "Be right back, Thunder," he murmured, adjusting his hat to better shield his eyes from the relentless sun. Silver Creek, Colorado, 1882. A mining town that had flourished despite the harsh conditions of the Rocky Mountain foothills. Quentin had never thought he'd return, but fate had other plans. After years of drifting from ranch to ranch, taking work where he could find it, he'd finally managed to save enough to buy his own plot of land just north of here. It wasn't much, a small cabin, some decent grazing land, and a creek that ran clear even in the driest months, but it was his. He pushed through the door of the general store, the bell overhead announcing his arrival. The familiar scent of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods greeted him. A few other customers browsed the shelves, but Quentin paid them no mind as he approached the counter. "Afternoon," he said to the shopkeeper, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Need to stock up on some supplies." The man nodded, reaching for a pencil and a sheet of paper. "New around here?" "Not exactly," Quentin replied, removing his hat. "Been away for a while. Just bought the old Miller place up north." "Well, welcome back then. What can I get you?" Quentin began listing off the items he needed: coffee, flour, sugar, salt, ammunition for his rifle, a new axe handle. The shopkeeper nodded along, scribbling each item on his paper. "And some tobacco," Quentin added, "if you've got it." "Just got a fresh shipment in yesterday," the shopkeeper said. "It'll take me a bit to gather all this up. Why don't you look around while you wait?" Quentin nodded and turned away from the counter, his gaze drifting over the store's offerings. That's when he saw her. She stood in the far corner, examining a bolt of blue fabric. Her back was to him, but there was something about the way she held herself, the curve of her neck, the rich auburn of her hair gathered in a neat bun at the nape. His heart stuttered in his chest. It couldn't be. And then she turned, as if sensing his gaze, and their eyes met across the cluttered store. Those eyes deep green like the pines that surrounded his new home, eyes he'd never been able to forget, no matter how hard he'd tried. "Quentin." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to him as clearly as if she'd shouted. "Ruby," he replied, her name feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on his tongue. Ruby Caldwell. The woman who had stolen his heart under a canopy of stars, then shattered it beneath the harsh light of day. She moved toward him, the fabric forgotten in her hands. She looked different than he remembered, older, yes, but also more refined. The girl he'd known had been replaced by a woman. Her dress was simple but well made, a deep green that complemented her eyes. A small gold locket hung at her throat, catching the light as she approached. "I didn't know you were back," she said, stopping a few feet away from him. "Just arrived," he replied, finding it hard to meet her gaze. "Buying the Miller place, the old homestead by Whispering Creek," a smile touched her lips. "My father always said that was the prettiest piece of land in the county." Quentin nodded, feeling suddenly awkward. The last time they'd spoken, they'd exchanged heated words that still burned in his memory. "It needs work, but it's got potential." "I'm sure it does." Ruby hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric she held. "It's good to see you, Quentin." He wasn't sure how to respond to that. Good wasn't the word he'd have chosen. Surprising, maybe. Unsettling, painful, but not good, not yet. "Your order's ready, mister," the shopkeeper called, breaking the moment between them. Quentin cleared his throat. "I should." He gestured toward the counter. Ruby nodded, taking a step back. "Of course, I need to finish my shopping as well." He turned to go, but her voice stopped him once more. "Quentin, I'm at the old place if you want to talk." The old place. Her father's ranch just east of town, where they'd met for secret rendezvous beneath the stars. Where they'd whispered promises and dreams that had dissolved like morning mist. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and moved to the counter to pay for his supplies. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Quentin loaded his purchases onto Thunder's saddle, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He hadn't expected to see Ruby again, and certainly not so soon after his return. He'd thought he'd have time to settle in, to build his defenses back up before facing the ghosts of his past. He'd come to Silver Creek for supplies, nothing more. But now, as he mounted his horse and turned toward the road that would take him back to his homestead, he found himself hesitating. The smart thing would be to ride away, to focus on the life he was trying to build for himself. But when had he ever done the smart thing when it came to Ruby Caldwell? With a sigh, he turned Thunder in the opposite direction, toward the Caldwell ranch. Just to talk, he told himself, just to clear the air. The sun was setting by the time he reached the familiar gate, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The ranch looked much as he remembered it, a large main house, a barn, several outbuildings, all nestled in a valley with mountains rising behind them. The cottonwood trees that lined the drive had grown taller, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze. As he approached the house, a figure emerged onto the porch. Ruby, waiting for him. She'd changed out of her town dress into something simpler, a blue cotton frock that made her look more like the girl he'd known. Her hair was down now, falling in loose waves around her shoulders. Quentin dismounted, tying Thunder to the hitching post. "You were expecting me," he said, climbing the steps to the porch. "Hoping," she corrected, offering a small smile. "Would you like some coffee, or perhaps something stronger?" "Coffee's fine," he replied, following her into the house. The interior was warm and inviting, lit by the golden glow of oil lamps. The furniture was familiar, the same heavy oak table in the dining room, the same worn leather chairs in the sitting area. But there were changes too. New curtains at the windows, a different rug on the floor. And photographs on the mantel that hadn't been there before. Ruby moved to the kitchen, busying herself with the coffee pot. Quentin stood awkwardly in the doorway, watching her. "Your father not home?" he asked, noticing the quiet of the house. A shadow passed over Ruby's face. "Pa passed 2 winters ago, pneumonia." "I'm sorry to hear that," Quentin said, genuinely saddened. John Caldwell had been a good man, fair and honest. "He was always kind to me." "He liked you," Ruby replied, pouring the coffee into 2 cups. Even after everything." She handed him a cup, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact sent a jolt through Quentin, unwelcome and unsettling. "The ranch is yours now, then?" he asked, stepping back to put some distance between them. Ruby nodded, gesturing for him to follow her to the sitting area. "Mine and my brother's, though Richard spends most of his time in Denver these days. He's got a law practice there." Quentin settled into one of the chairs, holding his coffee cup like a shield. "And you're running this place on your own." "We have good hands," she said, taking the seat across from him. "And I've learned a lot since you left. Had to." There it was, the first acknowledgement of his departure, of the wound that still festered between them. "Ruby," he began, not sure what he wanted to say, but feeling the need to say something. She held up a hand to stop him. "We don't have to talk about that, not yet. Tell me about your travels first. Where did you go when you left Silver Creek?" Quentin took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. South at first, New Mexico territory, worked on a cattle ranch there for a while. Then Texas. Spent a couple of years driving herds up to Kansas. "Dangerous work," Ruby commented, her eyes studying him over the rim of her cup. He shrugged. "It suited me at the time, kept me moving, and now you're ready to stay put. That doesn't sound like the Quentin Hayes I knew." "People change," he said simply. 5 years is a long time." "Yes," she agreed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It is." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words and memories. Through the window, Quentin could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. It was under such stars that he'd first kissed Ruby a lifetime ago. "Are you married?" he asked suddenly, the question burning in his throat. Ruby looked up, surprise flashing across her face. No, there were opportunities, but no. Relief washed over him, followed immediately by confusion. Why should it matter to him if Ruby was married? Their time had passed. Whatever they might have had was destroyed years ago. "And you?" she asked. "Did you find someone in your travels?" Quentin shook his head. "No, never stayed in one place long enough for that." Another silence, less tense this time. Ruby stood, moving to the window to look out at the gathering darkness. "It's getting late. You shouldn't ride back to your place in the dark, not with the trail so overgrown." "I can manage," Quentin said, rising to his feet. "I'm sure you can," she replied, turning to face him. "But there's no need, we have plenty of room here. The guest bedroom is made up." He hesitated. Staying here under the same roof as Ruby seemed like a dangerous proposition. But she was right, the trail to his homestead was rough even in daylight. "If you're sure," he said finally. "I am," she offered, a small smile. "It's just for one night, Quentin. I think we can manage to be civil for that long." There was a hint of the old Ruby in her smile, the teasing, confident girl who had captivated him from the first moment he'd laid eyes on her. It made his heart ache. "I suppose we can," he agreed, finishing his coffee. "Thank you." Ruby showed him to the guest room, a simple space with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a washstand. "There's fresh water in the pitcher," she said, lingering in the doorway, "and extra blankets in the chest if you get cold." "I'll be fine," Quentin assured her, setting his hat on the dresser. "Good night, Ruby." She hesitated for a moment, as if there was something more she wanted to say, but then she simply nodded. "Good night, Quentin. Sleep well." After she left, Quentin sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. What was he doing here? He'd come back to Silver Creek to start fresh, to build a life far away from the memories that had haunted him. And yet here he was, right back where it had all begun and ended. He moved to the window, looking out at the night sky. The stars were brilliant here, away from the lights of town, each one a pinprick of silver against the velvet blackness. It was under such a sky that he and Ruby had shared their first kiss behind the barn during a summer dance. He'd been 22, she just 19. Young and foolish and certain that the world was theirs for the taking. With a sigh, Quentin turned away from the window. The past was the past. Tomorrow, he would return to his homestead and focus on the future he was trying to build. A future that couldn't include Ruby Caldwell, no matter how much his treacherous heart might wish otherwise. Morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through the window and rousing Quentin from a fitful sleep. He dressed quickly, eager to be on his way. The sooner he left the Caldwell ranch, the sooner he could put this unexpected reunion behind him. But when he entered the kitchen, the scent of coffee and frying bacon greeted him, along with the sight of Ruby at the stove, humming softly to herself. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, a smile brightening her face. "Good morning," she said. "I was hoping to have breakfast ready before you woke." "You didn't have to go to the trouble," Quentin replied, feeling awkward in the domestic scene. "It's no trouble," Ruby assured him, gesturing to the table. "Sit, the coffee's fresh." He did as she asked, watching as she moved about the kitchen with practiced ease. She'd always been at home here, confident in a way that had both intimidated and attracted him. That hadn't changed. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before him. "Well enough," he lied, reaching for the coffee. "Thank you for the room." Ruby joined him at the table, her own plate considerably smaller than his. "It was the least I could do. Besides, it's nice to have company. The house gets quiet with just me here most of the time." "No ranch hands stay in the bunkhouse?" Quentin asked, digging into his breakfast. "Only during roundup or when we're bringing in a herd," she explained. "Most days, the men ride in from town." Quentin nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. It was good, strong, and hot, just the way he liked it. "Your ranch doing well, then?" "Well enough," she echoed his earlier words with a small smile. "We've had some lean years, especially after Pa died, but we're holding our own." "I'm glad to hear it," Quentin said sincerely. Whatever had happened between them, he'd never wished Ruby ill. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the distant calls of birds outside. It was strange, Quentin thought, how comfortable it felt to be sitting across from Ruby after all this time. As if the years between had somehow compressed, leaving just the good memories and none of the pain. But the pain was still there, simmering beneath the surface. The questions that had never been answered, the accusations that had never been refuted, the broken promises and shattered dreams. "I should be going," he said, pushing back from the table. "Got a lot of work to do at the homestead." Ruby nodded, rising to clear the plates. "Of course, I appreciate you stopping by, Quentin." He stood, reaching for his hat on the peg by the door. "Thank you for the meal and the room." "You're welcome here anytime," she said, her back to him as she washed the dishes. Neighbors should look out for each other. Neighbors, was that what they were now? Just two people who happened to live in the same vicinity, right? He agreed, settling his hat on his head. "Well, goodbye, Ruby." She turned then, wiping her hands on her apron. "Goodbye, Quentin." He nodded once and stepped outside into the bright morning sunshine. Thunder was waiting patiently at the hitching post, nickering softly in greeting. "Ready to head home, boy?" Quentin murmured, untying the reins and swinging up into the saddle. As he rode away from the Caldwell ranch, he couldn't help but glance back once. Ruby stood on the porch, watching him go. She raised a hand in farewell, and he did the same before turning his attention to the trail ahead, home. The word felt strange in his mind. He hadn't had a real home since leaving Silver Creek 5 years ago, just a series of bunkhouses and rented rooms, places to sleep between jobs. Now he had land of his own, a cabin that needed work but could be made comfortable. A future that was his to shape. But as he rode toward his homestead, Quentin couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing from that future. Something he'd left behind years ago and had just found again. Ruby watched until Quentin disappeared from sight, his figure growing smaller against the backdrop of mountains and sky. She hadn't expected to see him again, had convinced herself that he was gone for good. And yet here he was, back in Silver Creek, buying the Miller place of all things. A property not 30 minutes' ride from her own ranch, fate had a cruel sense of humor. With a sigh, Ruby turned and went back into the house. There were chores to be done, ledgers to balance, decisions to make about the herd. She couldn't afford to spend the day dwelling on the past. But as she moved through her daily tasks, Quentin's face kept appearing in her mind. He'd changed in the 5 years since she'd last seen him. There were new lines around his eyes, a hardness to his jaw that hadn't been there before. His hair was longer, streaked with a few strands of silver at the temples. But his eyes were the same deep blue and full of questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. By mid-afternoon, Ruby had given up any pretense of productivity. Her thoughts kept circling back to Quentin, to the conversation they hadn't had, to the words that remained unspoken between them. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, slamming shut the ledger she'd been attempting to update. "You're a grown woman, not some lovesick girl." But that's exactly what she felt, like a girl again, with her heart racing at the mere thought of Quentin Hayes. It had been 5 years. 5 years of building a life without him, of convincing herself that what they'd shared had been little more than youthful infatuation. So why did seeing him again affect her so strongly? The answer was simple, though she was loath to admit it, because what they'd had was real. Because she'd loved him with a depth and intensity that had frightened her. Because she'd made the biggest mistake of her life in letting him go. With a determined set to her jaw, Ruby rose from her desk and went to saddle her mare. There was only one way to settle the tumult in her mind. She needed to see Quentin again, to have the conversation they should have had years ago. The conversation they'd begun to approach last night before retreating to safer topics. The ride to the Miller place, Quentin's place, now took her less than half an hour. The trail was familiar. She'd ridden it countless times over the years, sometimes just to look at the abandoned homestead and remember the dreams she and Quentin had once shared. Dreams of a place of their own, a home they would build together. The cabin came into view as she crested a small hill, nestled against a backdrop of pine trees with the creek running just beyond. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Ruby could see Quentin in the yard, chopping wood with powerful strokes of an axe. He'd removed his shirt in the heat of the day, and she couldn't help but notice the play of muscles across his back as he worked. She slowed her mare to a walk, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing here? What did she hope to accomplish? Would Quentin even want to see her, or would he view her arrival as an unwelcome intrusion? But it was too late for second thoughts. Quentin had spotted her, pausing in his work to shade his eyes against the sun. He stood motionless for a moment, then set down the axe and reached for his shirt, pulling it on as he walked toward her. "Ruby," he greeted her, his expression unreadable. "Everything all right?" She dismounted, feeling suddenly awkward. "Yes, everything's fine, I thought I should check on you, make sure you were settling in all right." It was a flimsy excuse and they both knew it, but Quentin merely nodded, gesturing toward the cabin. "Would you like to come in? It's not much to look at yet, but I've got the stove working." "I'd like that," Ruby replied, tying her mare to a nearby post. The cabin was indeed sparse, a single room with a stone fireplace at one end, a cast iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. But it was clean, and Quentin had already made some improvements. The windows gleamed, the floor had been swept, and a bouquet of wildflowers sat in a jar on the table. "It's a good start," Ruby said, taking in the space. "The Miller place always had potential." "That's what I thought," Quentin agreed, moving to the stove to put on a pot of coffee. "It needs work, but the bones are solid, and the land is good, plenty of water, decent grazing." "Planning to run cattle?" Ruby asked, removing her hat and setting it on the table. "A small herd to start," he replied. "Nothing like what your family has, but enough to get by." Ruby nodded, walking to the window to look out at the creek and the mountains beyond. "It's beautiful here, I always thought so." "I remember," Quentin said quietly, his voice closer than she expected. She turned to find him standing just a few feet away, his eyes on her face. The intensity of his gaze made her heart flutter. "You do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember everything, Ruby," he said, still holding her gaze. "Every word, every promise, every star in the sky the night you told me you loved me." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Ruby felt a lump forming in her throat. "Quentin," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing she needed to say something. "Why did you come here today?" he asked, cutting her off. "Really?" Ruby took a deep breath. "Because we need to talk. Because there are things I need to say to you, things I should have said 5 years ago." "And what would those things be?" His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "That I'm sorry," she said simply. "That I made a mistake, that I was young and scared and listened to the wrong people. That not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted letting you walk away." Quentin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a hint of the pain he'd carried all these years. "You didn't just let me walk away, Ruby. You pushed me out the door." "I know," she admitted, feeling tears prick at her eyes, "and I've hated myself for it ever since." He turned away from her, moving to the stove where the coffee had begun to boil. With deliberate movements, he poured 2 cups and brought one to her, keeping a careful distance between them. "It's been 5 years," he said finally, leaning against the table. "Why bring this up now?" "Because you're here," Ruby replied, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Because when I saw you in the store yesterday, it was like no time had passed at all, because I need you to know the truth, even if it changes nothing." Quentin took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "And what is the truth, Ruby? Because all I know is that one day you were telling me you loved me, and the next you were telling me to leave town and never come back." Ruby closed her eyes briefly, the memory of that day still painful. "The truth is that my father was in debt. Bad debt to bad people. He'd borrowed money to expand the ranch, and when the drought hit, he couldn't pay it back." "What does that have to do with us?" Quentin asked, confusion evident in his voice. "Richard Nash," Ruby said, the name still bitter on her tongue. "He held the notes on my father's debt. He offered to forgive them in exchange for my hand in marriage." Understanding dawned on Quentin's face. "And your father agreed to this?" "No," Ruby said quickly. "He would never. But Nash made it clear what would happen if I refused. The ranch would be taken, my father would be ruined, possibly worse. Nash had connections, powerful ones. He wasn't a man to cross." "So you agreed," Quentin said flatly. "You chose the ranch over me." I chose my family's safety, Ruby corrected, setting down her cup. And the only way to make sure you would go, that you wouldn't try to fight for me, was to make you believe I didn't love you anymore. Quentin was silent for a long moment, processing her words. But you didn't marry Nash. No, Ruby agreed. My father found out what I'd done, what Nash had demanded. He went to Denver to an old friend who had connections of his own. Together, they found a way to pay off the debt to free us from Nash's grip. But by then, you were gone, and I didn't know how to find you, how to explain. Quentin set his cup down with a thud, turning away from her to face the fireplace. His shoulders were rigid with tension. 5 years, Ruby. 5 years of thinking you'd never loved me at all, that everything we'd shared had meant nothing to you. I know, she whispered, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. And I will regret that until the day I die, but I need you to know that I did love you, Quentin, with all my heart. I still do. The last words fell from her lips without thought, a truth she'd carried in her heart for 5 long years, a truth she'd never expected to voice aloud. Quentin turned slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something else, something that made Ruby's heart beat faster. What did you say? She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I said I still love you. I never stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Ruby could hear her own heartbeat, the distant rustle of leaves outside the window, the soft hiss of the fire in the stove. But Quentin said nothing, his face unreadable. I should go, she said finally, reaching for her hat. I've said what I came to say. I don't expect anything from you, Quentin. I just needed you to know the truth. She moved toward the door, but his voice stopped her. Wait. Ruby turned, hope and fear warring within her. Quentin took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. Do you mean it? Do you really still love me? Yes, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to fall. I never stopped. Not for a single day. Slowly, as if afraid she might vanish, Quentin raised a hand to her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. I tried to hate you, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. I tried so hard, but I couldn't. Because no matter what I believed you'd done, no matter how much it hurt, I never stopped loving you either. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. Quentin. And then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with increasing urgency. His arms went around her, pulling her against him as if he feared she might slip away again. Ruby returned his kiss with equal fervor, her hands clutching at his shoulders, her tears mingling with the taste of coffee on his lips. When they finally parted, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. I can't go through that again, Ruby. I can't lose you a second time. You won't, she promised, her hands framing his face. I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. He kissed her again, more gently this time, as if sealing her promise. When he pulled back, there was a question in his eyes. Stay with me tonight. Ruby knew what he was asking. It wasn't proper, wasn't what a respectable woman should agree to. But they had already lost 5 years, and she couldn't bear to lose a single moment more. Yes, she whispered. I'll stay. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of rediscovery. They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of the years they'd spent apart. Quentin told her of his travels, the places he'd seen, the work he'd done. Ruby spoke of the ranch, her father's final years, her brother's success in Denver. They shared meals at the rough table, their knees touching beneath it, their hands finding excuses to brush against each other. As dusk fell, they walked together along the creek, the setting sun painting the water in shades of gold and pink. It was under such a sky that they had shared their first kiss, all those years ago. Now they walked hand in hand, the weight of the past finally lifting from their shoulders. I have something to show you, Quentin said, leading her to a ridge overlooking the property. I discovered it yesterday while exploring the land. Ruby followed him up the gentle slope, her hand firmly clasped in his. At the top, she gasped. Spread out before them was a stunning view of the valley, the mountains rising majestically beyond. The first stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It's beautiful, she breathed, taking in the panorama. I thought so too, Quentin agreed, his arm slipping around her waist. And I thought, someday I'd like to build a house here, a real house, not just a cabin. Ruby looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. It would be perfect. Quentin turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Ruby Caldwell, I loved you 5 years ago and I love you now. I don't want to spend another day apart from you. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me right here under these stars? Tears sprang to Ruby's eyes once more, but this time they were tears of joy. Yes, Quentin Hayes. Yes, I will marry you. Yes to all of it. He pulled her into his arms, his kiss full of promise and passion. Above them, the stars began to appear one by one, witnesses to a love that had endured against all odds, a love that was finally coming home. The wedding was held 6 weeks later, on a crisp autumn day when the aspens had turned to gold, and the mountains were dusted with the first snow of the season. It was a small affair, held at the Caldwell Ranch with only a handful of guests. Ruby's brother Richard, who had come from Denver for the occasion, a few trusted ranch hands, and the minister from Silver Creek. Ruby wore a simple dress of ivory silk, her hair adorned with wildflowers. Quentin wore the only suit he owned, purchased specifically for the occasion. They exchanged vows in the garden where they had once walked as young lovers, promising to cherish and honor each other for all the days of their lives. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a feast prepared by the ranch cook, with music provided by one of the hands who played the fiddle. As the sun began to set, casting its golden light over the festivities, Richard stood to offer a toast. "To my sister and her husband," he said, raising his glass. "May the love that brought you together keep you strong through all of life's challenges, and may you never again waste a single day apart." Cheers rose from the small gathering, glasses clinking together in celebration. Ruby, seated beside Quentin at the head of the table, felt her heart might burst with happiness. "Are you happy, Mrs. Hayes?" Quentin whispered in her ear, his hand finding hers beneath the table. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, turning to brush her lips against his. As night fell, the newlyweds slipped away from the celebration, mounting their horses for the ride to their home. Quentin had worked tirelessly in the weeks since their reunion, improving the cabin to make it more comfortable for them both. It wasn't the grand house they planned to build on the ridge that would come with time, but it was theirs, a place to begin their life together. Under a canopy of stars, they rode side by side, their path lit by the full moon that hung low in the sky. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every glance, every smile, conveyed the depth of their feelings for each other. When they reached the cabin, Quentin dismounted first, then lifted Ruby from her saddle, holding her close for a moment before setting her on her feet. "Welcome home," he said softly, taking her hand to lead her inside. The cabin was transformed. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a new quilt adorned the bed, and flowers filled every available container. Candles cast a warm glow over the space, and a fire crackled invitingly in the hearth. "When did you do all this?" Ruby asked, taking in the romantic scene. "I had some help," Quentin admitted with a smile. "Your brother's wife has good taste." Ruby laughed, turning in a circle to admire their home. "It's perfect." Quentin moved to her side, his arms encircling her waist. "You're perfect," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot just below her ear. Ruby sighed, leaning back against him. "I still can't believe this is real, that we're here together." "Believe it," Quentin said, turning her in his arms to face him. "This is just the beginning, Ruby. We have a lifetime ahead of us." His kiss was tender at first, then increasingly passionate as the events of the day faded away, leaving only the two of them in their private sanctuary. Ruby responded with equal fervor, her hands exploring the broad expanse of his shoulders, the solid strength of his chest. Later, much later, they lay entwined beneath the quilt, the fire burning low in the hearth. Ruby's head rested on Quentin's chest, his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, sending pleasant shivers down her spine. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Ruby smiled, pressing a kiss to his skin. "I'm thinking about the future, about the house we'll build on the ridge, about the children we might have someday." Quentin's arm tightened around her. "I'd like that. A house full of children with your eyes and spirit." "And your strength and kindness," Ruby added, raising up on one elbow to look at him. "I love you, Quentin Hayes, now and always." "And I love you, Ruby Hayes," he replied, drawing her down for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, now and forever. Spring came early to Silver Creek the following year, bringing with it new life and renewal. The snow melted from the mountains, feeding the creeks and rivers that ran through the valleys. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the air was filled with the songs of returning birds. On the Hayes homestead, work was well underway on the new house. Quentin had hired a crew from town to help with the construction, determined to have it completed before winter set in again. The foundation was already laid on the ridge, and the frame was beginning to take shape against the backdrop of mountains and sky. Ruby, now 5 months pregnant with their first child, divided her time between the Caldwell ranch and the homestead. She had insisted on maintaining her involvement in the ranch operations, at least until the baby came. Quentin, though initially concerned about her taking on too much, had come to appreciate her business acumen and knowledge of cattle. "We're going to need more hands for the summer drive," Ruby said one evening as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset. "Richard says the contracts in Denver are good this year. We could make a tidy profit if we can get enough cattle to market." Quentin nodded, his hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. "I've been thinking about that. What if we combined our herds, my small one with your larger operation? We could run them together, share the costs and the profits." Ruby turned to him, her eyes alight with interest. "A partnership between the Hayes and Caldwell ranches. Why not?" Quentin asked. "We're already partners in everything else, and eventually this little one will inherit both properties anyway." He was right, Ruby realized. It made perfect sense to combine their operations. "I like it," she said, covering his hand with her own. "Hayes and Caldwell Cattle Company, it has a nice ring to it." "Hayes, Caldwell and Son," Quentin corrected with a grin, rubbing her belly. "Or daughter." Ruby laughed, leaning into his embrace. "Either way, I think we're building something special here, don't you?" Quentin pressed a kiss to her temple. "We already have, my love. We already have." The summer drive was a success, despite Ruby's insistence on accompanying the herd part of the way to Denver. She rode in a wagon rather than on horseback, conceding that much to her advancing pregnancy and Quentin's concerns. But she was determined to be involved, to see the first joint venture of their new company through to completion. By the time they returned to Silver Creek, the new house was nearly finished. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with large windows to capture the stunning views, a deep porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and a stone fireplace that anchored the main living area. It was everything they had dreamed of and more. "What do you think?" Quentin asked as he helped Ruby down from the wagon, supporting her with a gentle hand at her back. "Will it do?" Ruby took in the sight of their new home, her eyes filling with happy tears. "It's perfect, Quentin." "Absolutely perfect." They moved in a week later, just as the first hints of autumn began to touch the aspens with gold. The house still needed finishing touches: curtains for the windows, paintings for the walls, the 1,000 small details that would make it truly theirs. But it was home, their home, built on the land they both loved. Their son, John Quentin Hayes, arrived on a crisp October morning as the sun was just beginning to crest the mountains. He came into the world with a lusty cry, his tiny fists clenched as if ready to take on whatever life might bring. "He's beautiful," Quentin whispered, cradling his son in his arms for the first time. "Perfect, just like his mother." Ruby, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband and son with a heart full to bursting. "He has your eyes," she observed, reaching out to touch the downy head. "And your determined chin." Quentin laughed softly, carefully returning the baby to Ruby's waiting arms. "Poor child. Let's hope he has your temperament to balance it out." "I don't know," Ruby teased, adjusting the blanket around their son. "I rather like your stubborn streak." "It brought you back to Silver Creek after all." "No," Quentin corrected, sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping an arm around his wife and child. "It was fate that brought me back. Fate and the need for supplies." Ruby smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Then I'm grateful for fate." "And for supply shortages." Quentin pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to the top of his son's head. "As am I, my love, as am I." The years that followed were filled with both joy and challenge, as all lives are. The Hayes and Caldwell Cattle Company prospered, growing to become one of the largest operations in the county. The drought years were difficult, but they weathered them together, their partnership in business as strong as their partnership in life. John was joined by a sister, Eleanor Ruby, 2 years after his birth. And 3 years after that, the family welcomed twins, a boy and a girl named Robert and Rose. The house on the ridge was filled with laughter and love, with the patter of little feet and the occasional argument quickly resolved. Quentin and Ruby worked side by side, building their ranch and raising their family. They had disagreements. Of course, Ruby was too willing to take risks for Quentin's comfort, and he was sometimes too cautious for her taste. But they always found their way back to each other, their love deepening with each passing year. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Quentin surprised Ruby with a special gift. He took her riding, just the two of them, while Richard and his wife watched the children. They rode to a spot. They both knew well, the small clearing behind the old Caldwell barn where they had shared their first kiss all those years ago. A blanket was spread on the ground, a picnic basket waiting beside it. And hanging from the branch of the old oak tree was a wooden swing, newly built but reminiscent of the one that had hung there in their youth. "Oh, Quentin," Ruby breathed, dismounting and moving toward the swing. "It's just like the old one." "I thought you might like to have it back," he said, coming to stand beside her. "For our children and maybe someday our grandchildren." Ruby turned to him, her eyes shining with love. "Thank you, for this, for our life together, for everything." Quentin drew her into his arms, his kiss as tender and passionate as it had been on their wedding day. "Thank you for giving me a second chance," he murmured against her lips, "for believing in us when I'd lost faith." "I always believed," Ruby replied, her hands framing his beloved face. "Even when we were apart, I believed that somehow, someday, we would find our way back to each other." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, they sat together on the blanket, sharing the picnic and watching the first stars appear. "Do you remember the first time you kissed me?" Ruby asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Right here under the stars, how could I forget?" Quentin replied, his arm tightening around her. "You were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. You still are." Ruby smiled, tilting her face up for his kiss. "We've come full circle, haven't we? Back to where it all began." "Not full circle," Quentin corrected, his eyes filled with love as he gazed at the woman who had captured his heart so many years ago. "Just the beginning of a new chapter. We still have so many stories left to write together." "I like the sound of that," Ruby said, nestling closer in his embrace. Above them, the stars winked into existence one by one, silent witnesses to a love that had endured against all odds. A love that had been lost and found again, stronger for the trials it had faced. A love that would continue to grow and thrive for all the days of their lives. As night fell over Silver Creek, Quentin and Ruby Hayes sat entwined beneath the stars, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them back together. A twist that had begun on a dusty afternoon when a cowboy rode into town for supplies and found the woman who had once kissed him under the stars. 20 years later, the Hayes and Caldwell Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in Colorado. The original homestead cabin still stood, now used as a guest house for visiting friends and family. The house on the ridge had expanded over the years, with additional rooms added as the family grew. John, now 20, had recently returned from 2 years at college in Denver, eager to take on more responsibility in the family business. Eleanor, at 18, had her mother's head for figures and her father's quiet determination. The twins, Robert and Rose, 15 and full of energy, were still deciding their paths, though both showed a natural affinity for ranch life. On a warm summer evening, the family gathered on the wide porch that wrapped around the house, watching as the sun set behind the mountains. Quentin and Ruby sat side by side in the rocking chairs they'd purchased for their 15th anniversary, their hands clasped between them. "I was thinking," John said, leaning against the porch railing, "about expanding into the western section next spring. There's good grazing land there, and with the new railroad spur coming through, we could increase our shipments to Denver." Quentin nodded, pride evident in his eyes as he looked at his eldest son. It's a solid plan. What do you think, Ruby? Ruby smiled, squeezing her husband's hand. I think our son has inherited the best of both of us. It's an excellent idea, John. Eleanor, seated on the porch steps with a ledger open on her lap, looked up. The numbers support it. If we reinvest the profits from this year's drive, we should have enough capital without taking on debt. Always thinking of the bottom line, Robert teased his sister, ruffling her hair as he passed by with a glass of lemonade. Someone has to, Eleanor retorted, smoothing her hair back into place. We can't all spend our days racing horses and flirting with the blacksmith's daughter. Rose giggled, nudging her twin brother. She's got you there, Rob. Robert flushed, but took the teasing good-naturedly. At least I'm not the one who nearly set the kitchen on fire trying to impress young Dr. Wilson with my biscuits. Now it was Rose's turn to blush, while the rest of the family laughed. Quentin watched his children with a heart full of contentment. They were good people, strong and kind, with their mother's spirit, and he hoped, some of his steadiness. They were the greatest blessing of his life, along with the woman who sat beside him, her hand warm in his. What are you thinking about? Ruby asked softly, noticing his reflective expression. Quentin turned to her, taking in the face he'd loved for so many years. There were lines around her eyes now, strands of silver in her auburn hair. But to him, she was as beautiful as the day he'd first seen her, a young girl laughing beneath the summer sun. I'm thinking about how fortunate I am, he replied, raising her hand to his lips. How rich my life has been because of you. Ruby's eyes softened, the love of a lifetime reflected in their green depths. We've been blessed, she agreed, more than I ever dreamed possible. As twilight deepened into night, the younger members of the family drifted away one by one, John to check on a mare about to foal, Eleanor to finish her calculations, the twins to whatever mischief 15-year-olds could find on a summer evening. Quentin and Ruby remained on the porch, rocking gently as the stars appeared overhead. It was a familiar ritual, this quiet time they shared at the end of each day. A moment to reflect, to connect, to simply be together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come back to Silver Creek that day? Quentin asked, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. Ruby considered the question. Sometimes, I like to think we would have found our way back to each other eventually. That some things are simply meant to be. Fate, Quentin said with a smile, echoing a conversation they'd had many times over the years. Fate, Ruby agreed, and perhaps a little divine intervention. Someone was looking out for us, I think. Quentin nodded, his eyes on the star-filled sky above them. Well, whoever or whatever brought us back together, I'm grateful. As am I, Ruby said softly. Every single day. They fell silent, comfortable in each other's company, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whicker of horses in the paddock, the rustle of wind through the aspen leaves. Sounds that had formed the backdrop of their life together, a symphony of home and belonging. After a while, Ruby stood, extending her hand to her husband. Come to bed, my love. Tomorrow we'll be here before we know it. Quentin rose, pulling her into his arms for a kiss that still held all the tenderness and passion of their youth. I love you, Ruby Hayes, now and always. And I love you, Quentin Hayes, she replied, her arms encircling his waist. Now and forever. Hand in hand, they walked into the house they had built together, leaving the porch empty save for the gentle creaking of the rocking chairs in the night breeze. Above, the stars continued their eternal dance, shining down on the land that had witnessed their love story, a story that had begun beneath just such stars, when a young cowboy had kissed a rancher's daughter and promised her the world, a promise that, despite the odds and obstacles, he had kept. A promise that had grown into a legacy of love, family, and home. A promise that had started with a kiss under the stars and had blossomed into a lifetime of happiness, proving that sometimes the greatest journeys begin when we find our way back to where we truly belong.